31-0. 3-1-0. If you frequent college football channels online, you see this score posted all the time, especially come playoff time, and especially when it is written by Clemson football fans, and rightfully so. They boast about it, and they have every right to do so, especially if they're in conversation with another power of the sport, Ohio State. Ohio State fans, on the other hand, cringe at the sight of 31-0. How do they explain it? How do they get away from it, especially when it's attached to two prior defeats to Clemson in the 1978 Gator Bowl and the 2013 Orange Bowl? And then added onto it the most important of the three, 31-zip. That means 0-3 for Ohio State. Well, this Saturday, much of that's going to be erased or maybe added onto. So if you're a Clemson fan and you get another win over Ohio State, you're now 4-0 against maybe the major brand in the history of the sport, or certainly one of the top 3 or 4 in the history of the sport. The best winning percentage of all time belongs to Ohio State. They are fast tracking down Michigan for the number of all-time wins. Clemson, though, could be 4-0 as of Saturday night with 2 college football playoff wins over Ohio State. We're not just talking about wins in September in 1983 when both teams then finished 8-4 and it didn't really much matter. We're talking about 2 bowl victories followed by 2 college football playoff wins. And for Ohio State, 0-3 cannot be erased. Those first 3 losses cannot be erased. They're etched in history forever, but of course, the here and the now can belong to the Buckeyes en route to a national championship appearance against either LSU or Oklahoma. So Saturday night is huge for the history of both programs, and certainly in regards to the power structure of college football, which right now is owned by Clemson, with Alabama and Ohio State right there. How much does that 2016 result weigh upon what's going to happen here in 2019, 3 years later in the same stadium? Psychologically, we have no idea, but there are players that will be on the field with major roles that also had major roles in that game. So I did some diving into the rosters to determine, okay, who's back from that game 3 years ago in which Ohio State was blanked offensively for the only time in the history of Urban Meyer's career by that Clemson defense that went on to win the national championship. How many players are back for Clemson? How many back for Ohio State? Let's first address Clemson. Now, my numbers might be slightly off. So if you want to do a deeper dive than I, certainly go at it. Correct me in the comments section below, because what I did was I went to the 2 rosters. And of course, anyone who was a true freshman in 2016 would be a senior currently. Now, had players redshirted, they could have been a redshirt freshman then a redshirt senior now. Obviously, I counted them as well. So I counted everybody possible that is a current senior or redshirt senior on either roster to determine that they were at least on the roster for the 2016 Buckeyes and Tigers. But, of course, there are junior college transfers, so there could be seniors currently who were not on the roster. So my roster figures might be off by 1 or 2, but the significance of the correlation will be dead on, because these are players who played significant roles to any degree in the 2016 playoff game and will be playing on Saturday night a significant role. So first for Clemson, it's not nearly as many as Ohio State. So the Clemson roster currently only has 4 seniors. There are only 4 seniors on the current Clemson roster. So for the 2016 Clemson Tigers, you had 4 players who are still prominent players on the roster and making an impact for this football team that played in that playoff game against Ohio State. Kayvon Wallace, safety. 6 tackles that season with an interception and a tackle for loss, but now a prominent player in the ACC. 58 total tackles for Clemson. 2 tackles for loss, a sack, 2 interceptions, gives him 5 career interceptions. So Kayvon Wallace decent player. Special teams, got in on some snaps against Ohio State in 2016, but now one of the prominent players on the Clemson defense as a senior. We also have a host of offensive linemen that actually were players, starters, took a number of snaps in 2016 as true freshmen. Now we'll be suiting up against Ohio State once again. It's Tremaine Ankrum, who was at the time playing significant minutes for Clemson. Now he's a first-team All-ACC performer. Started 13 games, had a start in that season against Ohio State, and had 36. Yeah, I botched this up. I can't read my own writing. Good Lord. No. So let's first look at the 2016 Clemson Tigers with 4 players who will be back for the playoff game on Saturday night against Ohio State that were part of the 31-0 whipping of the Buckeyes. At safety, Kayvon Wallace. Special teams player as a freshman. Played some snaps in the secondary. 6 tackles on the season, an interception, and 1 tackle for loss. Now a prominent player on the Clemson defense as the starter. 58 total tackles, one of the top tacklers on the team. 2 tackles for loss, a sack, 2 interceptions this season, 5 career picks. So Kayvon Wallace, significant player to a certain extent, special teams player as a freshman in 2016, prominent starter in 2019, will face the Buckeyes again. Now the rest of them, surprisingly, along the offensive line, 3 players who started as freshmen or had significant snaps as freshmen in 2016 in taking Clemson to a national championship, still prominent players, even more so for Clemson here in 2019. Tremaine Ankrum. He had 13 games played back in 2016 en route to a national championship, had a start, and actually played 37 snaps for Clemson in that playoff game against Ohio State and had 1 knockdown. What do we not bring you here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, that Tremaine Ankrum had 1 knockdown against the Buckeyes in 2016. Now he is a first-team All-ACC performer along the offensive line, so obviously he has proven to be a capable player. We've got John Simpson as well, who had in that championship season of 2016, he had 10 snaps against Ohio State in the playoff game. Played 9 games, had 160 snaps on the season, so he got into the offensive line rotation. But now, John Simpson, one of the very best offensive linemen in the country as a senior, Outland semifinalist this year in 2019, first team All-ACC. And then you have Shawn Pollard, again, a contributor as a freshman for Clemson in 2016, had 53 snaps, played almost the entire game against Ohio State in 2016 as a freshman, played 95 snaps the entire game against Alabama to win the national title in 2016, and he shared Offensive Rookie of the Year status for Clemson in 2016, along with the aforementioned tackle Tremaine Ankrum, and he had 7 starts in 12 games, and he is one of the better offensive linemen for Clemson. Still, Pollard, Ankrum, and Simpson along the offensive front for Clemson, prominent players as freshmen. Now they are stars along that offensive line, and Kayvon Wallace at safety. Now, the list for Ohio State is pretty lengthy, and this is pretty extraordinary considering how young this football team was in 2016, and many of us remember that it was the youngest football team in the country, and they reached the playoffs. Maybe they weren't ready for the playoffs, apparently not, but the youngest football team in the country reached the college football playoffs, and now these guys are seniors, many of them. So let's start with Jordan Fuller at safety. 11 tackles, played on special teams back in 2016, had 1 tackle against Clemson in the playoff game. Now Jordan Fuller's an all-Big Ten performer, either 1 or 2 on the team in tackles in 2017 and 81 total stops this year. Again, all Big Ten performer. You also on the defense have in the defensive backfield Damon Arnett, who had 21 tackles on the season in 2016 and a pick and had a tackle against Clemson, 34 tackles this year and an interception, his 5th career pick. Also defensively up front, Davon Hamilton got into action in 2016 and got into the backfield, 2.5 tackles for loss and a half a sack, 10 tackles, and had a tackle against Clemson. This season, Davon Hamilton, 8.5 tackles for loss and 5 sacks as a senior. Robert Landers. What a contributor as a freshman for the Buckeyes in 2016 with 8 tackles for loss and a sack and 16 total tackles. This year he has 5.5 tackles for loss and has concluded his Buckeye career with a couple games to go, possibly with 23.5 tackles for loss. You've got Malik Harrison, possibly the best linebacker, most notably for the Buckeyes now, with 16 tackles for loss and 3.5 sacks. Back in 2016, 13 tackles for the Buckeyes during the regular season, played snaps against Clemson in the playoff game. All right, on the offensive side, you've got Benjamin Victor. Had the second biggest yardage total for the Buckeyes on one play against Clemson, a 21-yard catch in that game. He had 4 catches on the season, scored a touchdown, and again against Clemson had a 21-yarder and a pass interference call against the defender covering him on one of the Buckeyes' few futile drives in which they scored no points and missed 2 field goals. Benjamin Victor now, 3 years later as a senior, 32 catches, 6 touchdowns, averaging about 17 yards per reception on his career, 80 catches, 18 touchdowns for Victor. Austin Mack back in that 2016 season, 2 catches, 15 yards. Didn't catch a ball against Clemson. He's now a guy that catches 21 passes, 3 touchdowns, and has had big receptions for the Buckeyes, again, most notably against Michigan, down 20-14 in the third quarter on a third and long play from Dwayne Haskins. But Austin Mack has proven to be productive for the Buckeyes, 72 catches, 6 touchdowns. How about KJ Hill? Well, there you go. KJ Hill had a catch against Clemson for 8 yards back in 2016. Caught 18 passes that year and a touchdown. Well, now he's one of the most productive pass catchers in the history of Ohio State football. 51 this year, 10 touchdowns, 195 for his career, and 20 touchdowns for KJ Hill, one of the best slot receivers. Actually, according to the advanced metrics, the most effective slot receiver in college football this year. Then you got the tight end Rashad Berry, who caught a couple passes this year, has 17 career receptions, 4 touchdowns as a senior. Back in 2016, Rashad Berry was a defensive lineman, not a tight end, a defensive lineman who had 7 total stops. So that's your roll call for Clemson football in 2016, who played in that game. Interestingly enough, 3 freshman offensive linemen were significant in that game, and in Clemson's championship run, they are 3 of the best offensive linemen in the ACC right now. Again, for the Buckeyes, it's a number of pass catchers and defensive backs that played a role, were on the field for many snaps against Clemson in being embarrassed 31-0. What will they show us as seniors on Saturday night? Would love to get your comments in the comments section below. Like, comment, share the videos on social media, and subscribe right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.